videos, I discussed briefly the gulf that separates U.S. presidents' rhetoric and the reality of the factors affecting Syria's descent into a decade-long war. U.S. presidents show a sort of a rhetorical arc stretching from President George W. Bush to President Trump today. And this arc more or less concurs that a core of moderate rebels who sought greater freedom from a maniacal dictator, Bashar al-Assad, received insufficient help, resulting in a vacuum filled by jihadists. And I did reference the Defense Intelligence Agency's report from 2012 that shows the opposition was supported by jihadists from the beginning. So they didn't fill a vacuum, they simply were the crux and the core of the opposition. Moving forward, I'd like to look at a diplomatic cable that was included in the WikiLeaks trove that was published in 2011 and 12 as well. Some of these cables go back to 2005, 2006, so they're very illuminating in that they happen to foreshadow a lot of events that would come thereafter. So the diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks show that the West was anticipating and suggesting ways to destabilize Syria using methods that, if they were used in America, would be deemed subversive and dangerous. Imagine if the U.S. discovered Syrian diplomats from their embassy in Washington distributing diplomatic cables wherein they identified scenarios that could, if staged correctly, render Trump or Obama vulnerable to an overthrow. And if in that same diplomatic cable, those same Syrian diplomats recommended reaching out to certain opposition groups in Mexico and Canada that they knew were hostile to the U.S. to coordinate efforts to exploit cracks in the foundation of U.S. presidents and their cabinets and their administrations, just imagine the reaction that would be. Well, I would argue that the diplomatic cables that WikiLeaks posted beginning in 2011 show that that's exactly what the U.S. was doing more or less in Syria. We in America don't ask those questions ourselves very often, and plus those diplomatic reports include strategic recommendations for accomplishing regime change in Syria, and they certainly closely resemble what transpired in 2011 and continued thereafter. One example of the U.S. diplomats foreseeing the Islamists threatening Assad's regime is stated in a memo dated in December 2006. This was a U.S. diplomatic cable sent from Damascus and distributed to various groups, including the U.S. Department of Treasury, the National Security Council, the White House, Secretary of State, Tel Aviv, and the League of Arab States. The U.S. diplomatic cable assesses the conditions of Syria thus, I will quote at length, quote, "We believe Bashar, as in Bashar al-Assad's weaknesses, are in how he chooses to react to looming issues, both perceived and real, such as the conflict between economic reform steps, however limited, and entrenched corrupt forces. The Kurdish question and the potential threat to the regime for the increasing presence of transiting Islamic extremists." Transiting, I would assume, is just foreign Arab jihadist, or more specifically, Sunni jihadist, rather than using, transiting kind of gives it a hygienic flair, but it's still the underlying reality is the same. It's terrorists outside of Syria coming into the country to destabilize it. The cable summarizes our assessment of these vulnerabilities and suggests that there may be actions, statements, and signals that the U.S. government can send that will improve the likelihood of such opportunities arising. These proposals will need to be fleshed out and converted into real actions, and we need to be ready to move quickly to take advantage of such opportunities. Many of our suggestions underline using public diplomacy and more indirect means to send messages that influence the inner circle, end quote. This is again a U.S. diplomatic cable prepared and distributed in 2006, 5 years before the Arab Spring ignited in 2011. The language here involves more than an objective assessment of conditions. Rather, it gleans from the assessment opportunities to facilitate actual regime change. In my previous video, I referenced the DIA report from 2012, wherein it states that the Salafist and jihadist rebels supported opposition to Assad from the beginning. The diplomatic cables from 2006 and the DIA report in 2012 show a continuity in the U.S. policy towards Syria, which is a preference to see and both promote regime change. Equally critical is that U.S. diplomatic cables encourage using both Saudi and Egypt to coordinate efforts to destabilize Assad's regime. For instance, from 2006, it states, quote, "Encourage rumors and signals of external plotting. The regime is intensely sensitive to rumors about coup plotting and restlessness in the security services and military. Regional allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia should be encouraged to meet with figures like Saddam, who is a former vice president of Syria and public vociferous opponent of Bashar al-Assad. So regional allies like Egypt and Syria should be encouraged to meet with figures like Saddam and as a way of sending such signals, with appropriate leaking of the meetings afterwards. This again touches on the insular regime's paranoia and increases the possibility of a self-defeating overreaction." End quote. Now, if you apply this template to our elections, we've been trying to convince ourselves that Putin did something similar since 2016. Somehow we're blind to the fact that we're attempting various such matters, such objectives in Syria, and we think we can do it with impunity. But as you can see, I don't think such myopia is sustainable. So the inaccurate presenting of who initiated the insurgency in Syria effectively obscures the what and what they're trying to accomplish. By misstating the who, the mainstream media misstates the what. Once we more accurately identify who and what it is doing and what it seeks to accomplish, the war in Syria will be more accurately seen as Syria resisting foreign insurgents operating as proxies for other nations. Other facts may reveal that's not a sound theory either. However, right now, given what we've been presented with and what the facts say, the glowing rhetoric of Obama and the more blustering rhetoric of Trump, the reality is something else. And so we should stay tuned, so hopefully we can teach ourselves a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you for watching my video, and my name is Romelet of Fil-Am World Magazine. I will see you again on my next videos, so please don't forget to hit subscribe. Okay? So you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again.